Greetings, class. It's Wednesday, January 22nd. It was unfortunately a snow day, ice day, something. It's very cold outside. So class was canceled, which is going to put us a little behind. I don't think it'll be too bad. But I wanted to put this video out there to give people a sort of background of what we'll be looking at in terms of federalism, so we can save a little bit of time in class. On Friday, I want to go over in class some more stuff on the political compass, personal political ideology paper, things like that. So I want to at least get some of these basic concepts out there, and so everybody should watch this. Okay. PowerPoint slides are probably online at this point if you want to open those up. I'm just going to go through a couple of things. You don't necessarily have to. But so first, what is federalism? So we're talking about what is federalism. Why did you read a chapter on it? Federalism is essentially a divided system of government between the state governments and local governments and the federal government. There's in all federalism systems, there's it's not necessarily a hierarchy of governments, but there's a division of powers and authority between the governments. There's some things that the states or provinces or parishes or territories or whatever they're called in the country or state that we're talking about. Those entities have some sort of power, and then the national government has also some sort of power. There's some sort of power sharing agreement, things like that. So we have a federal system, the federal government, the national government having some powers, and the state governments having powers. And a lot of the political debate over the past 200 plus years, basically since the founding of this country, has been over what that federal system should look like. Where should power be centered? Should it be centered at the federal government or the state governments? Which political issue or responsibility of government should be carried out at which level of government? So is education best handled at the state and local level or the federal level? How much, if the education policy is best set at, say, the state level, how much funding or input or influence should the federal government have? What does it mean to have influence? Some questions. We'll probably talk about some of those, hopefully some of those detailed things in class on Friday. But essentially, there are two types of federalism. More or less, they're divided that way. So we have dual layer federalism and cooperative federalism. These two things are also known as layer cake federalism and marble cake federalism. So in dual layer or layer cake, you have sort of like this. You have a clear dividing line between the federal level of government and the state level of the government. The federal level has certain powers and certain authorities that it handles, and the state has its powers and authorities and mission and whatnot that it handles. And there isn't much, if any, overlapping. The federal government either handles it or the state government handles it. It's sort of, there's no in between. Now, the cooperative model of federalism, or marble cake federalism, is a little more like this, where there's the federal level and the state level, and there's a lot of interlocking in terms of authority and in terms of power. So the federal government will give the mandates to the states. They'll say, listen, states, you should do this. We're going to provide funding for it. We're going to let you control it, but this is something that you need to do. So an example of cooperative federalism might be the interstate highway system. The federal government wants to build interstates all across the country. This is in the 50s. So what they did was they said, state governments, we want this national goal to have this interstate highway system. And here's some, they had some basic sort of like structure and some very basic plans that they wanted the highway system to have. They want everything to be this wide. They want it to be made of this, strong of a material. They want to follow sort of this general route. The federal government says, if you plan these highways in your state and say you're going to build them, we'll provide 90% of the funding for them. And so, of course, states jumped at the chance to have interstates built through their state at very low cost to them, because it brought a lot of economic development, having those federal dollars coming into the state. The states, however, retained a lot of control in the interstate highway system in that they got to plan out sort of specifically where they went and whether or not they got built in the first place. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in urban politics, but basically the federal government kind of said, we want an interstate highway system to go between Charlotte and Atlanta. Local governments and state governments between Charlotte and Atlanta plan the exact route through cities or around cities, through specific counties, things like that. So that's an example of cooperative federalism. The history of how we view federal government is very interesting and very important politically. Has some implications for us today, as long as it's good to know as well as it's good to know where we came from. So when the country first started out, we had this sort of layer cake system, dual federalism, clear line of authority between the federal government and the state government. There was not much overlap. The federal government didn't do a lot of social programs and things like that. They had the VA very early on, or a prototype of the VA very early on. That was one of the main and only social programs they did. The states were mostly in control of any sort of social programs, welfare, and in reality they didn't do much. So that's how the country initially was there. Dual layer federalism, very clear lines of authority between the two, very clearly delegated powers between the federal and state governments. And in this case, the federal government was in general weaker than the state governments, or had less powers. So that goes from the founding until about the Civil War. During the Civil War, we have this little hiccup, as you might imagine, where the federal government all of a sudden takes over a lot more power to fight the war against the South. Lincoln he suspended some rights, he started collecting some income tax, he drafted people into the army. The army was still, very segregated along the state lines. There was a lot of state pride in the army, even in the North, in their specific units. But it was there was a much more federal government involvement in that and everything. After the Civil War ended until 1877, the federal government essentially controlled much of the South during Reconstruction. The federal government worked to protect the rights of recently freed peoples. That ended in 1877 during a presidential election, which we'll talk about in class. Once the federal government pulled out of the South, things returned to their dual-layer federalism stuff, and then freed people, black Americans, started having their rights trampled on again. So we'll get to that. But, so while we had the sort of brief foray of the federal government having more power and more of a cooperative federalism deal going on, it was still very much a dual-layer system until the progressive era, which, depending on how you look at it, 1880s to 1920s, 1930s-ish, started building up slowly, and then it got quicker once you hit the 1900s. Essentially, there were a lot of problems in America. Child labor was becoming a really big issue for people as we had increased industrialization and children working in coal mines and sweatshops and things like that. The labor movement was really picking up, and people were looking more and more to government to regulate the economy, to provide for basic protections and rights for individuals, to try and correct some of these social ills. A lot of this was still done at the state level, and there was a lot of push for it to be done at the federal level. The Supreme Court, though, kind of like pushed back some and held it into a dual-layer system. But the sort of groundwork and philosophical ideology there was established for a cooperative federalist system. What we see is when we have shifts in where power should be located at the federal government or the state government, we often see some sort of like major crisis center around that. So the Civil War, where we had a larger federal government involvement in issues, the Civil War did that. The Progressive era, we saw a lot of problems arising from the Industrial Revolution, health and sanitation concerns with more people moving to cities, child labor issues, things like that. And then we had the 1930s. And in the 1930s was the Great Depression. The Great Depression is very significant in that it largely established a sort of framework for today's federal system. The Great Depression exposed the complete and utter inability of states and charity to respond to social ills, to major crises, economic crises. And with unemployment very, very high, poverty very, very high, economy in a complete and utter tailspin, the federal government had to step in and provide the support that state governments and charity just did not have the financing and ability to do. And with that, we get our cooperative federalist system, and that created the first sort of really integrated marble cake federalism. This kind. We had Social Security passed. We had unemployment benefits and different other. We had other social programs. Now, a lot of these social programs were funded by the government, had the sort of basic outline made by the government, federal government, but they were administered by the states, and that's how we keep that federalist system. So that's the Depression. After the Depression, after World War II, trust in the federal government was never higher. After all, the federal government had just taken us out of the Great Depression and had just beaten the Nazis. We had beaten the Nazis through the power of our national government. Yay us. Big deal, right? And as such, we began to see policy proposals and policy ideas shift from a more state-centered approach, where the states had the majority of the power, to a more federal-centered approach, where the national government was sort of setting the priorities for the nation, was funding any initiatives, was creating regulations, was getting involved in the economy, was creating social programs, things like that. So we had this strong marble cake federalism with a stronger central government. Civil rights happened because of that. We got the interstate highway system because of that. Medicaid and Medicare. Medicare was more of an example of that strong central government, whereas Medicaid is an example of that cooperative federalist system where the federal government says states need to do this, and then the funding for Medicaid is split between the federal government and the state governments. And the state governments then also have a wide range of requirements they can have for Medicaid. So some states, for example, allow people to have Medicaid up until like 133% of the poverty line or something like that. Whereas other states, if you're above like 25% of the poverty line, you do not get Medicaid, regardless the federal government pays it, pays part of it. Now, what we have today is different than what we had in the 50s and 60s. And why is that? Well, a couple things led to that, and they all sort of happened at the same time. So we have Nixon, we have Watergate, and we have a lot of backlash to the civil rights era. So, in case you didn't know, civil rights was not easily won. The southern states are terrible, at least at this time, and we can have an argument about today if we want to. But the federal government was very much involved in southern states and basically forcing civil rights down their throats because they would not accept it. As a matter of fact, if y'all know Loving versus Virginia, it's a Supreme Court case that banned Virginia's law against interracial marriage. It was finally the case that allowed interracial marriage across the country, made it legal. That case was 1967 is my guess. Loving v. Virginia. I'm pretty sure it's not 68. I think it's 1967. That's when interracial marriage finally became legal across the entire nation. There are lots of states that didn't, or that had laws on the books against interracial marriage. North Carolina filed a amicus brief, which is a friend of the court brief, on behalf of Virginia. So what that means is North Carolina filed a argument supporting Virginia's case banning interracial marriage, and this was in 1967. Federal government opposed to this. Supreme Court obviously was opposed to interracial marriage as they struck it down. Bans on interracial marriage 9-0. That causes a lot of resentment in southern states that we still see today, and stems from the civil rights era, where there's distrust of the federal government because they supported civil rights. So the federal government did. So that's one thing that has caused this current backlash to the federal government. The next thing was Nixon. People are hopefully aware that Nixon was involved in a very major scandal. It's called the Watergate scandal. We'll get into it a little more, but the Watergate scandal showed the Nixon regime to be very corrupt, causing people to lose more faith in the federal government to do things. And finally, we have Vietnam, which was pretty terrible war for a lot of people. It was the first time we saw live video of war on TV, and the Vietnam War caused a lot of backlash to the federal government. So we have civil rights in the South causing a lot of backlash to the federal government. We have Nixon, and then we have Vietnam. All this serves to weaken the federal government's sort of the center of power at the federal government level for our federalist system and move more power and authority to the states. So we have here still after Nixon from 1970s, from like Carter until now, we still have a cooperative federalist system. We still have that marble cake federalism, but we have more of a focus on states' rights and states' authority than we do on the federal government, or at least than we do comparatively to the 30s to Nixon. So what does today's marble cake federalism look like? It's often called New Federalism. New Federalism. The federal government will still set priorities, create mandates. However, they're less likely to fund them. So we talk a lot about unfunded mandates. That's from the people that have supported the new federalist system, new federalism. In the 40s, 50s, and 60s, we had these things called categorical grants, which the federal government would provide funding to states for specific projects. So they'd say, all right, Alabama, we're going to give you a grant of $50 million to build 17 parks in poor communities or something. They switched those to block grants. Now, block grants, the federal government says, Alabama, here's $50 million, have fun. There's a lot less restriction, to no restriction on how the state can use the money. So while we have that cooperative federalism where the federal government is still involved in providing support and having some power, the state governments have more control over what happens with specific policy issues. I think the Affordable Care Act is a great example of this new federalist system where the federal government has sort of created these general guidelines as to what the healthcare marketplace will look like. They've created general guidelines as to what insurance companies need to cover. Other than that, though, they've left the decisions about how they're going to run the exchanges, how they're going to regulate the markets, how they're going to balance Medicaid versus the subsidies, up to the states. As a matter of fact, it's the state insurance commissioners that largely control what happens with the Affordable Care Act, not the federal government. So there are insurance commissioners in each state. The 50 state insurance commissioners get together and they decide a good majority of the regulations, how the Affordable Care Act will be implemented, things like that. So the federal government's here saying, let's do this thing. Let's try and get everybody to have health care or health insurance. And, mandate it for all the people to have or pay a tax penalty. But they say we're going to provide all this money for the to help implement the program, but we're going to leave a lot of what's going to happen with the Affordable Care Act in the hands of the states. And so today you see a good amount of variety in the different states as to how they've implemented the Affordable Care Act. Let's see, anything else interesting that's a good example of that? There's the basic definition of cooperative federalism today is more authority and more power is being pushed from the federal government down to the state level. State governments and local governments are now more in control of regulating the economy, providing social services to people than they were during the Depression towards until about Nixon, and then where it was more federal government focused. And then if you go back before then, you have more dual layer federalism system going on. So I think that's about all I'll go over. In class, we'll go over some interesting stuff about inequalities, benefits, and drawbacks with the federal federal system. But that sort of brief overview of federalism is like the history of it, and a definition of it is very important for you to know, and hope people have enjoyed it. Later.